All right, thank you for joining us tonight. As people cycle in, I'll kind of do the bookkeeping part of the conversation so we can get to the informative, fun, and maybe even frightening conversation about press freedoms. As you're logging in, please tell us in the chat where you're from. We always like to get a sense of where people are zooming in from, to really show that this is an international community for SBJ, as the name suggests. We really do have a worldwide audience, and so we want to showcase that. It's always fun to see everyone. I'm Matthew T. Hall. I'm the national president of the Society of Professional Journalists, and I am zooming in from San Diego, where apparently the weather is much nicer than it is in the DC area. And if this is your first time joining us on these IC talks, the international community of SBJ is a community of journalists that encourages press freedom globally. And that literally is our subject here today. The format's simple. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about this stuff. You'll see there's a chat function and a Q&A function. Please drop your questions in the Q&A forum, and use the chat for like logistical or technical issues that you may be having. And Dan Kubisky, one of the co-chairs of the international community, will help you there. If you do have a question for our guests, you have two options. You can drop it in there and let me know if you'd like me to ask it, or if you want to ask it, let us know that too, and we'll unmute you and you can ask the question yourself. We do ask that you keep it short and concise so that we can get to as many folks as possible. And as always, we're recording this and we'll upload it to our YouTube channel so you can share it with friends and family and continue this conversation. Now let me introduce our guests today. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Anna K. Nelson, the Executive Director of Reporters Without Borders in the US, Canada, and the English-speaking Caribbean, where she directs the organization's mission to protect and defend journalists internationally and in the United States. She worked as a journalist for more than a decade before becoming a humanitarian in 2006. RSF announced her appointment to this current position, I think it was 6 days after the US Capitol riots on January 6th. So that's some serious trial by fire right there. Thank you for joining us, Anna.
My pleasure, thank you.
And Jessica Jerreat she may have the best job title in journalism, Press Freedom Editor. Jessica is a US-based journalist for Voice of America, covering press freedom, censorship, and international news. Before joining VOA in March 2020, she was a senior editor at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and before that, she worked at outlets including the Times of London and the Daily Telegraph. Jessica, thanks so much for being here today.
Hi, looking forward to it.
So let's get to it. Let me set this up. Yesterday, obviously, was World Press Freedom Day. Every day is World Press Freedom Day, if you ask me. But it's a day that we celebrate and commemorate the anniversary of the Windhoek Declaration, defining universal values for all of this stuff. 30th anniversary of this year, importantly. And that anniversary came just a few weeks after Reporters Without Borders released its most recent World Press Freedom Index, which you all have been doing now for 20 years. Is that right, Anna?
Almost. Next year will be 20.
Okay, I jumped it a little bit. So long time though, a lot of data there. And just for those who need a refresher or didn't see it, some pretty stunning numbers in there this year show that journalism is completely or partly blocked in 3 out of 4 of the 180 nations. That's a pretty stunning statistic. And that 7% of those nations have a good environment for press freedom, 20% fairly good, 1 in 3 are problematic, 29% bad, 12% very bad. So Anna, first question to you, let's get this conversation started. Why are there so few good environments, and what exactly does that mean? What's the trend? What's the trend that we're seeing here?
Well, thank you very much. And just from the outset, thank you for providing this opportunity. And it's really an honor to be able to speak with our guests and, hope there'll be some really great questions. Indeed, so every year we come out with our annual index. And as you rightly said, we drew an analogy this year to the vaccine, and essentially journalism being the most effective means by which we can inoculate societies against the viral ills, if you will, of disinformation, of lies, conspiracy theories, all of the issues that I think arguably led up to the events that you mentioned here in Washington with the insurrection again on the Capitol building. And so I think that is one of that triple threat is one of the biggest trends that we observed this year, is just the rampant viral spread of disinformation. And I think, obviously when we're talking about press freedom, it encompasses a lot of things, and I'm sure that Jessica will expand upon that. But it requires an environment where journalists can do their job safely, where we see so much propaganda, censorship in many countries. The ones who really are at the worst offenders, if you like, at the bottom of the list is where you see state control of the media and of the messaging. And I would say, and I'm sure we're going to get into this a little bit more as the conversation goes on, but obviously COVID was the common denominator across the board over the past year, which isn't in itself surprising, but it is incredibly worrisome to the degree to which these authoritarian regimes in particular used the pandemic as a means to prevent journalists from being able to do their work, but also to spin their own version of the facts. And whether that was in some instances, basically pretending there was no problem, to offering a false information and false narratives about how to address it. We saw that here in the United States. So those are, I guess, some of the more let's see, I like the word common denominator, but the issues that we saw across the board, resulting in a shrinking space for those environments where press freedom is possible and valued.
Yeah. And before I do bring Jessica in, let me ask a follow-up. I mean, every time I see the index come out, I'm reminded of the scientists who have the doomsday clock, and have us 2 minutes to midnight or 90 seconds to midnight. If you don't want to say how bad it is historically, if it is as worse as it's been, obviously it's been a problem for decades and will continue to be despite all of our best efforts. What is the trend? How close to midnight are we in terms of press freedoms and them being taken away in many parts of the world?
I mean, it is worrisome. It is very worrisome that I need to have a look at my notes, but that we have so few countries, I think, where we have the possibility of press freedom, where journalists are able to do their job safely, where access to information is something that people have. I think if we're looking at, in particular here in the US, the numbers were really shocking last year when we, particularly with regard to violence and arrests. The US Press Freedom Tracker, who is one of our partner organizations, they registered around 400 assaults or attacks against journalists, and that was largely tied to the racial justice movement, and journalists trying to cover the Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of George Floyd's death, and then around 130 arrests. And I don't have the figures on the top of my off the top of my head, but they were unprecedented. In terms of the sheer numbers, and that being sitting where I sit here, that's of particular concern.
Yeah, I share that concern. Jessica, let me bring you into the conversation. So you, over the weekend, just edited a really stunning look at reporters in Afghanistan, which obviously is front of mind for a lot of people on the international stage. The U.S. military is withdrawing its troops by September, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And so the country will look a lot different this year than it has. There may be some instability. Women in particular are worried. Tell me a little bit about your series, and then kind of how that country's situation is kind of almost like a microcosm of what we're seeing around the world.
Yeah, sure. So I feel like Afghanistan's really in this sort of pivotal moment where they are, after 20 years of conflict, Kabul and the Taliban are going to sit down for these peace talks, and it could be this end of like the everlasting war that we've been having there. And very early on, sort of the peace talks started in September, and really almost immediately we started to see media being targeted, like deliberately targeted and killed just for reporting. And I mean, like the Taliban say it's not them, but they have this long history of carrying out attacks. And the message was just very suddenly clear to journalists of, we don't have any certainty. We have no guarantees in this peace deal about what this means. 20 years ago, after the fall of the Taliban, Afghanistan entered this new era. They'd gone from this one Taliban-run radio station, and now they have this vibrant media scene. And female journalists, right from the start, they were just right there. They were like suddenly had all this freedom in society, and they're taking on the big stories and having a voice. And that sort of has really been a success story in many ways. If you look at press freedom, that a country that went from no democracy was emerging as this new era, and they had journalism, they had people who were able to ask those difficult and troubling questions to the government. And in the short space of time since the peace talks, the government says that they're going to protect press freedom. That was in the 2004 constitution that was formed in Karzai's government. But there's nothing really firm. There's no firm guarantee. And for the journalists at the moment, what they're finding is they're making that difficult decision that we see so often in these press freedom stories of, do I stay when I'm under threat and that I could be killed if I go out in the street today? Or do I leave? Do I go into hiding, or do I actually try to leave the country? And really, it was just very interesting. One of the compelling parts that I really found about it was one of the journalists that we spoke to, Anisa Shahid. She's a TV anchor for one of Kabul's stations, Tolo News. And she said to us, I'm receiving threats, but I have to stay because people have got used to coming to me to tell my story. If I leave, they're not going to have that outlet. And I think that's just a really powerful example of what the media's role is in society. People very quickly in Afghanistan realized, oh, the media, I've got a problem, and the media can elevate that voice. They can make people pay attention. They can find some local official who's upset his community, his or her community, and keep asking questions. Why has this happened? Or why is this person being arrested? Or this school not receiving funding? Whatever it is. And the journalists, their community have all got used to having that freedom and that role of journalism now. And then as we go into the peace talks, it's just really a case of like, well, has it been for nothing? Are we going to survive? And I think really with the sort of pivotal moment, the troop withdrawal, it just seemed like an ideal way to look at like how far a country can come when you have a free and independent media, and when you have diversity within that, with men and women going out and reporting and making sure that all sides, like men and women's issues are just being equally reported on and covered, and how that sort of really relates in many ways to lots of the countries that we focus on.
Mm-hmm. So much of press freedom is a free, by definition, a free press, not a government-run press, a varied press with lots of outlets sharing perspectives and people's voices. To stick with Afghanistan for a minute, is there a fear that variety of outlets that has kind of thrived in the last 20 years or been resurrected, that will fall by the wayside, that will be injured, harmed?
There seems to be the sense sort of like, obviously the sort of the worst case scenario, but there is a sense already some outlets in areas in some of the provinces where militants or Islamic States regional group are operating, you're already seeing news outlets just coming under pressure, receiving directives, you can report on that clash, but you can't report on this. Very early on in the attacks, there's one station out in Jalalabad. It's a news and media entertainment station called NKS. And they've had one journalist and 3 media workers killed since September. And the message is really clear. We don't want women out reporting. We don't want this type of media. And one of the directors of that station told us he's had to, I think they had like 10 women working for them, and several of them have quit. And the others, they've said, just stop coming in. We're going to keep paying you, but they've basically just sort of put them on sort of temporary stay-at-home leave. Don't come in, it's too dangerous. And immediately you have a whole section of community just blocked. And I think there is a real concern that will, it might take its time to get to Kabul or the sort of areas that are a little bit more sort of government aligned. But it doesn't take long for that sort of domino effect to come. And it also doesn't take long for the message to get across. And very immediately with Afghanistan, you saw the killings rise, you saw threats coming up against journalists and female journalists particularly. And they leave the profession, they go away, they leave the country. And it's frustrating for them. They're now stuck, there's one journalist, he actually had to flee much sort of further in the past, I think it's 2016 or 2018, after a big attack on her station. And she's frustrated. There's this big story, this big moment in her country. And like any journalist, we want to be there. We want to be where the action is, but just for pure safety reason, you can't be there. You can't be there reporting on it as it's happening. And I think that's hugely damaging.
Yeah. Let's jump back to the global stage again. And Anna, I'm curious, if you look at the index, the Press Freedom Index, you see 4 of the 5 top nations are Scandinavian. Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark are 1 through 4, with Costa Rica rounding out the top 5. What is it about Scandinavian countries that they get it right?
It's a great observation. If I may, just to pick up on what Jessica was saying about Afghanistan, I think one thing we take for granted in Western cultures is when women are denied the ability to be a part of the storytelling experience, it really cuts off an entire segment of what matters. And when I was a humanitarian, I spent time in Pakistan, and I had the privilege, it was actually perhaps counterintuitively, I was able to spend time and talk to the tribal leaders, the men in the villages, but also then to go in and talk to the women in the tents. And obviously, this was at a mobile health clinic, and that was something obviously the men couldn't do. And I recognized in that moment what a tremendous privilege it was to be able to have access to both sides, if you will, of society. And so I think that's incredibly worrying, not only that there is that kind of pressure on female journalists to have to take life and death decisions about whether or not they will continue to play this pivotal role that has been so hard won over the past 20 years. And then what that means as well for all of the women in Afghanistan, when the journalist's voice is suppressed, so are their voices. So I think that's I hope that people are paying attention to that and looking at how to mitigate what the future holds there. But to go back to your point, Matt, indeed, RSF called it the Nordic model, the top countries that more or less they tend to change places within those top 3 spots, but generally rank very high up. And I think I was talking to a journalist actually in Minneapolis about this just before the Derek Chauvin verdict. And obviously you have a lot of people of Scandinavian descent living in Minnesota. I happen to be one of them, having come from Minnesota and being of Scandinavian descent. And I think we had a really interesting conversation around civility, and just I think in what I understood from him and the scholars who are actually tracking this phenomenon, what he said was that trust is, there's a fundamental level of trust between almost not a contract, but between the citizens of those countries and the news providers, where you don't have the same level of polarization, politicization of the news that we definitely see here in the United States. You also have the fact that much like Switzerland, and I think we could include the UK with its BBC model, Canada with the CBC, you have a kind of state-sponsored or state-led, now that sponsored and led are not the words I'm actually looking for, but essentially, broadcasters who have an allocated budget to be able to do what they do without having to kind of be ratcheting up the rhetoric in order to bring in viewers, and in a sense have this competition between opinion and news, we see that here, whether it's Fox or MSNBC. We have a bit of a blurring of the lines. And so from what I understand, just that kind of the notion of a social contract, in a sense, between news broadcasters and their constituents or their audiences makes a big difference. But I also think, having myself worked when I was in Switzerland as a journalist for their state broadcaster, I recall distinctly what a privilege it was to have a budget to go do stories on on an obscure vanishing dialect in a mountain community. I mean, the kinds of things that you need to have a budget to be able to do. So I think that's that makes a big difference.
I love that expression, social contract, that you just used. Jessica, pick up on that thought, and what do you see as you report on press freedom's kind of more boots on the ground aspect of this whole discussion? Is that something that you see as well, this notion of a social contract in countries and nations where there's a strong value placed on press freedoms?
I think, in countries where there's valuing, I think obviously like media trust is a big issue at the moment. And I think that's sort of driven a lot of the problems that we saw last year, particularly with just in so many countries, there were a lot of protests and journalists went from being the observers to being a target, from, security and protesters, people angry and not recognizing the journalist role there as this just independent, neutral observer. But I do think there are like some interesting models sort of building on that sort of contract and the sort of solidarity that we can have as journalists in furthering our work. And I found really interesting in recent years is the work of like Forbidden Stories and the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, who sort of take up the mantle of journalists who have been killed for their work, and they just follow the leads and they continue to sort of just show with solidarity, like, we can finish this work and we can show that, you can kill the journalist, but you can't kill the story. And I think that's just sort of very valuable to just keep reminding people that journalists, we kind of compete against each other. We all want to be first with a story, but there's also a benefit to all working together to pooling our resources, especially as if you're not a publicly funded broadcaster, that you're chasing budgets or, there's other things. But when we come together and we can share talent and resources, we can do a lot more. And we can also sort of use that as a mentoring of journalists who don't have a more established media. I think there's sort of an interesting model to see when you team someone up from the US and someone in a sort of more indigenous area in Brazil, and you can really take on the big stories that they couldn't take on themselves, like the sort of illegal mining or the environmental issues that can sort of run you into legal trouble with communities in those areas. And I think there's a big need for more solidarity, and also standing up and thinking about RSF's campaign for yesterday with Maria Ressa, the importance of someone like that. She's got, like, her and Rappler are doing this important work, and the online trolls are just trying to drown it out with this sort of false narrative about what they're actually doing. But if we can stand together and we can just make our voices louder and say, no, this is legitimate reporting, and there's a bigger story here that's more important than the lies that you're being spun, I think we have to be a little bit more organized in our response to the disinformation and the trolling of, like, our colleagues in the communities, because it's silencing out important stories and stories that need to be elevated at the moment.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and that Anna did as well, talking about the impact on women journalists, harassment, threats of violence. UNESCO just published a report last month interviewing, 900 plus journalists from more than 100 countries in multiple languages, and the findings, like with the RSF Press Freedom Index, were pretty stunning. Nearly 3 in 4 women said they had experienced online violence. 1 in 4 have been threatened with physical violence, and nearly 1 in 5 faced threats of sexual violence. So you just brought up Maria, who has done a few of these talks herself with the international community. She is incredible in the face of what she's had to deal with. What advice do you both have for journalists, especially women journalists, who are threatened? Let's talk about that aspect of press freedoms. Like you said, there's a chilling effect. A threat means a potential likelihood not to leave the industry, to not want to put up with that, to not feel like that's part of the job. It shouldn't be part of the job, but the reality is, those numbers show, is that cyberbullying, threats, actual violence are happening. What advice do you have for women, for all journalists, to kind of stave that off, to fight back against that, and what is the best way to do that?
Maybe I'll just say a little a word about Maria and the campaign, and the reason that RSF chose to highlight Maria Reza's case yesterday on World Press Freedom Day. Maria is an American, Filipino-American journalist. She was with CNN for a long time. That's how I came to know of her when I was a budding journalist in the 90s. She was at CNN in Manila and elsewhere. She is currently facing, it kind of varies depending on your definition, but it's essentially between 9 and 10 different cyber libel charges in the Philippines, against her and another journalist from Rappler, as you mentioned, the news site that she founded and she's currently the CEO of. And we decided to invite comments, videos from people all over the world to express their solidarity with her yesterday. And we've launched a website. We can share that in the chat, where you can, at any given time, you go onto the website and you'll find the video, which is on a loop and it's hours long, at a different spot where you can, hear somebody else featured talking about why they are, and it's the Hold the Line coalition, Hold the Line campaign that has been organized. It's not just RSF, it's a coalition of media advocacy or press freedom organizations. But I think they are in and of that, the crux of it, it lies within, to the extent that we have to stand up for each other. There is an important element of solidarity. And the women I know who have, especially who were covering ISIS and what was going on in Syria, it's no joke. The fears that they had, the threats that they were facing. I mean, I know 2 women who are very good friends who both experienced this, and really kind of not knowing if a knock at the door at night could spell something catastrophic. Having to be talking to the FBI on a regular basis. And okay, these are pretty high profile instances, but in any form, that's incredibly destabilizing. I mean, and then to continue to do the work. I mean, these friends of mine would not be deterred. And I think recognizing that and the dangers, whether they are in the digital space or in the physical world, they are very, very concerning. Jessica, I don't know if you want to pick that up.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of an important definition as well, because we're generally seeing a lot of like online harassment, but it doesn't take long for that to roll over into a physical threat. And it's also, I really think it's just sort of important to remember as well that like everyone's got a different level of what you can cope with, and there should be no shame in maybe you can get to the point where you're having people knocking at the door, or maybe there's someone stalking you, or it's becoming more serious, or it might just be that you're just being barraged with messages and unwanted images and things that you just shouldn't have to deal with. But people should just like be able to make that decision for themselves, like this is enough, and then they should really demand help and support from their newsrooms and from other agencies. And I know that the RSF, or the International Women's Media Foundation, a lot of groups have excellent resources, and just to sort of try to help navigate that, because certainly like when I started out, we were always taught, you just brush it off, it's just comes to the job, and you kind of have this sort of bravado. But I think now with social media and this ramping up of just very vile, hostile messages, just seemingly out of nowhere, or just because someone decides that you shouldn't be the person covering that, or a woman's voice isn't the valid voice on that subject. It needs to sort of, until we can find a solution to stop it at the source, we just need to make sure that we're all there supporting and not being told to just sort of brush it off or come off of social media for a while and let it die down and it'll go away. I think we really need to be having some big conversation. I don't know what the solution is, but I think there are like big conversations we need to be having about how to try to stop this and how to support each other. And as an editor, I think you always have to sort of keep in mind, like with your reporters, what they're going through, and sort of if there's sort of a level of trauma of what they're going through. I think we need to sort of recognize that we're moving away from a model where you deal with some sort of horrific crash or event and then you all just laugh it off and move on. I think there's becoming a wider recognition that we're seeing trauma and sort of an emotional toll that reporting can take, especially when you're taking on these big stories, or there seems like a never-ending cycle of something that's really affecting you, your community, or the groups that you identify with. And I really think that we need to just sort of recognize that and offer support and look for signs with our colleagues, and not be afraid to say to them, take some time, what can we do to help, or just listen and just really make sure that we're supporting each other. But again, I think it really does just come down to, at the moment now, we're just 24/7 connected in everything we do, that we really just need to be there and supporting each other and standing up for each other when we see a colleague going through this.
Well, and I think just to kind of pick up on that, I think too, there was so much training, and there still is, that goes into equipping journalists with going into hostile environments, and really in that physical sense linked to covering armed conflict or other types of violent situations. And I suspect that an equivalent for journalists dealing with cyber, digital threats, harassment, violence, because I think we should characterize it as such, is something to look seriously at.
Yeah, both of you guys hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is increasingly important. I agree with Jessica that journalists used to shrug it off and try to not talk about it and try not to let it bother you. But the reality is these stories can be, devastating and take a personal toll. And I'm glad, Jessica, that you said take the time if you need it, because if we can't cover the story, then we're not only hurting ourselves, but we're hurting the public who relies on the stories that we're telling. So it really does have a ripple effect. It is really important to have, to keep our mental health as well as we can. Let me ask you about that, this notion of the public, and it kind of gets back to Anna's point about a social contract. You're seeing more and more people having distrust of the media. It's hard to convince people that there's a public interest if the public isn't interested, right? So thoughts on that seems to be a big part of press freedoms, is that if the public doesn't share journalists and kind of journalist adjacent folks' desire to keep press freedoms front of mind and to keep it free for all, what do we do to kind of keep the public motivated and caring? How do we keep the public interested in this issue, so it's not just journalists talking in our bubble?
I mean, I think part of like the issue, and just to jump in, I think with we're losing a lot of our local news outlets, and I'm a little bit biased. I came up through like regional press in the UK, and it's just like this amazing like training ground, and you really get a sense of the immediate impact that journalism can have, but also an understanding of like every council meeting or court case that you attend over like some small infraction. Like these aren't being covered, and I think people are sort of losing the idea or the memory of what journalism is there to do. And from a local level, once you lose it at the local level, then it's harder to maybe take an interest at national level, because again, on social media, it's all being drowned out about, well, that outlet's just focused on that political side or this sort of bias. And I think until we can sort of really just re-inspire like the need for local journalism, or the impact that journalism can have and its importance and its ability to, we stand in for people, we help them to make sense of the world around them, or to understand how a decision is affecting them, or like just try to view everything from all sides. And the louder the conversation on social media, and people going more and more to social media for their news, drowns it out with, well, that's just biased, or an algorithm is only showing you what you want to see, or we talk about like the clickbait stories, so we're really only just feeding that little like doom scrolling sentiment that we want. Then we lose the main focus, which is journalism is there to serve the community, and it does sort of have this public role. And what we're losing when we're seeing these media deserts is that there's a void, and people are filling that with just, I don't know how you describe it, with not news, basically. And you're sort of losing the idea of what journalism is. And I think that's sort of worrying. And then especially when you start to see as well with countries, say like sort of Hungary, or like even Poland to an extent now, where when you start to lose your independent media and your local outlets, and they're being bought up, and the sort of tone changes, then the whole community, the whole country is no longer seeing an independent, an unbiased version of what's happening. And it doesn't take long for that to happen. Once that slide's gone in, once, the news industry, we're always under economic pressure. So as soon as you hit like economic pressure with a government or a sort of authoritarian person who really wants to drive that out, then it's just a sudden, very steep decline. And before you know it, there's just no journalism. No one even remembers what it was there for. You just have someone just espousing whatever the ruling party wants you to hear at that time. And it's, we need to just, I think, just find a way to support local journalism, to sort of really remind people of that role. And it kind of like, as a former local journalist, I'm always like, when you hear about another big city or community losing their paper, I'm always thinking like, we used to really complain about going to these like council meetings or being stuck on court duty, but like, who's there listening? Because those are the big decisions. That's where your tax dollars are being spent. Who's there paying attention? Because if it's not your local journalists, then like no one else is going to bother going and sitting in on like a 3-hour meeting about budgets. That's a concern for me.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot to unpack. Anna, thoughts?
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's exactly what I would say is the. I mean, I think trust is really the issue COVID brought that into stark relief, into devastatingly deadly contrast. We saw the consequences of distrust, of disinformation, and where that trust is created and born is in the communities where we live. And it is about, exactly as you say, Jessica, the day-to-day decisions that affect us as individuals, and then as families and as members of a community that make up the broader fabric. And so I think, when that starts to dissolve, and as you said, other actors come in to fill the void. And I think a lot of times, at least here in the US, that's people who very much have an agenda, who are partisan, who are driving, whose objective is not to necessarily shed light on uncomfortable truths or bring important stories to light. It's with a particular agenda. So I think absolutely we need to reinvest, keep investing in local news. And I think too, when we look at how many people get their news from social media, we also need to, I think, as responsible citizens, we need to give some thought to what it means when a social media platform can, in the as it was with former President Trump, for 4 years, essentially kind of turn a blind eye to what he was saying on Twitter, and then at the end of his presidency, deplatform him. I have a problem with the idea. I know a lot of people celebrated that decision, and I'm agnostic on that, but I take issue with the idea that you have unelected tech companies serving as the arbiters of what is news, what is truth, and what people have access to. So I think that's another. It's not an easy nut to crack, but it's definitely part and parcel, I'd say, with where people are getting their news is so important to that notion of trust. And here in the U.S., the model of Report for America, and kind of that almost as a civic duty type of thing. And Jessica, your point as well, just about as you're coming up as a journalist and you're honing those important skills, the critical skills, the simple, holding someone to account, and really figuring out what it means to get at the truth. That is if you skip those important steps, I don't know how well you necessarily deal with them when at a higher or perhaps broader level.
Yeah, I would definitely just on that. I think in terms of local journalism, it's not just sort of like really honing the skills, but when you live and work in the community that you're reporting on, you learn very quickly to get the story right and make sure that you've got all sides, because someone is going to stop you in the grocery store or wherever and point out your mistakes to you in person. So you learn very quickly that you have to serve, you're not just serving one interest, you're there to be, like I keep saying, like this neutral observer. You're there to sort of try to make sense of everyone's side, to make sure you've got everyone. And for me, I think it was like just such a valuable experience to come up through the local press. And I think that's one of the things that makes me saddest when I see that we're losing that and realizing that, audiences are losing their understanding of like how the local media can enrich their lives, and journalists are losing that sort of valuable, like early training ground.
Yeah. I see we have a question in the audience from Jim Fry. Jim, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Don't be shy, Jim.
I'm trying to unmute and I did not mean to raise my hand. I was clicking around, so I'm sorry about that. Go on and go to someone else for a question. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Anna, let me stick with you and ask how you get your stories at Voice of America. Are you assigning them to journalists all over? Are they coming to you with ideas? And you talked about partnerships earlier. I'm kind of curious how Voice of America handles this and tries to get these kind of difficult, thorny, kind of geopolitical issues into manageable stories that people can digest and remember and maybe make some changes after reading them.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like like the thing that I really I'm new to VOA. I joined in March, and literally like the day after I joined and I did all my HR forms, we all went into lockdown. So I've never actually stepped foot in the newsroom. I've met like maybe 3 or 4 colleagues through like the interview process. So it's been like an unusual year. But what I love about it is just like this amazing resource. We have like, I work in what we call like the Central News Department. We have 47 language divisions, and these journalists, they're pretty much living the experience of like the most sort of repressive areas that you can get. So VOA, we our sort of purpose as it is to sort of provide news in the areas where people don't have access to independent, free media. And we're there to sort of provide that. But it means that from my viewpoint, I just have this huge pool of talent and expertise and people who really understand. So when I'm sort of looking for stories, you know, sometimes I'll just check in with one of like the senior reporters or like a bureau chief or division chiefs, and just sort of try to get an understanding of what's happening. Because sometimes like you're first reading on a story, they'll be like, no, that isn't the issue. This is the big issue. And I think there's a lot of sort of talking and listening and trying to sort of understand and help them develop the stories. And sort of like say use these sort of partnerships, but we use like a range. We'll use sometimes one of our language divisions will have just reported, say like in Vietnam, we had a lot of stories ramping up of like sort of arrests and pressure on journalists late towards the end of last year when we were coming up to their sort of political party congress that they have every 5 years. And so I would see these stories coming through and use some of them, and then sort of sat down with the team and it's like, okay, like what's going on? How can we sort of make this broader and explain to people a little bit more about the context and help a wider audience understand what's happening in Vietnam, and not just like what's happening, but why it's important to care about it. And I think that's sort of what I'm always sort of trying to look for in a story is okay, this is happening in some small remote area that maybe people have never thought about before, but how is that important to the rest of the audience, to the rest of our readership?
Mm-hmm.
So really just sort of looking for stories like that, and platforms like RSF or like the Council of Europe and all these various amazing journalism platforms that leverage the cases of journalists, and then just looking for a way in. Like I'm always sort of interested that when you hear of like arrests or a new law, it's like, how is that going to impact the journalism? You know, if someone introduces a law that says that we're going to limit the number of foreign journalists that are able to report in a country, I'm always, my first thought is like, well, what story, you know, are they trying to hide us? Is there some kind of coverage they're hiding, or is it going to make it much harder to send resources there? Because if you can only have 2 journalists, you're probably going to put them in the capital to cover the main big political stories. But what's happening in that restive region, you know, 600 miles away that no one ever goes to? So I'm always sort of just trying to look at how is it going to affect the audience, and what does it mean to be a journalist in those areas?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I might, I was surprised when I joined RSF in January. I had no idea where Vietnam sat in in RSF's World Press Freedom Index, and this year it's at 175th out of 180 countries. So it's not in good company. You know, it's right there with China, Turkmenistan, North Korea, and Eritrea. So, you know, and we talked in this year's index about the fact that they reinforced control over social media, that they conducted a wave of arrests of leading independent journalists in the run-up, as you said, to the Communist Party's their 5-yearly Congress. And that actually included a journalist that had won the Press Freedom Prize that RSF gives out in 2019. So I think I can only say wonderful things about VOA and your sister news organizations. And I can speak now from experience, just in terms of the attention that the index got. We had the Mandarin service reach out. I can't remember all the different language services that reached out to cover the story, and you definitely see that level of local understanding, that nuance that comes with language, but that is about much more than that. And I can't think really of, perhaps the BBC, I can't recall how many languages they have, but just the sheer numbers of your audience and the breadth and depth of the coverage is kind of incredible.
Yeah, and I think as well, because they really know, we all really know the cost of what it means to not have a media, and just they are acutely aware of the early signs. I think once you've sort of been through, I think particularly a lot about Myanmar right now, and I know in the index it happened so quickly that you didn't really get to reflect as much about what's happening there, but certainly. I think one of your colleagues said it's wiped out 10 years of progress, just like that. Just, a coup and then we're gone. And you think about what they've, achieved so far, and that they can see the warning signs. It's just we've been through this before. It's just
the canary in the coal mine, the proverbial kind of, yeah. and yeah.
Yeah. And I think as well, that's something that, I see a lot in the patterns of RSF as well with your guys reporting is it's almost like everyone's working from the same playbook now. So with Myanmar, they had the coup, and the first thing they did, cut the internet, right? No one knows what's going on now. And that's something we've seen in Belarus and Tigray, just anywhere now that governments know, we don't want anyone to know about that, and just cut off the communication. And it's just a very sort of simple way for them to sort of work around, and and they can say, well, we're trying to protect national stability or stop inciting. That's no, you're just trying to stop the world noticing. But unfortunately, a large country just suddenly going silent is going to make us all wonder what's happening in there. But it's just this sort of playbook and trends that you see from one country to the other, and I think that really comes through in the index, and especially this year, like you say, with COVID and the emergency measures that just suddenly came in, or this pretext of we're fighting disinformation, and also all that criticism of us. It's just, those are the sort of frustrating trends that I feel you must just be working with every day. Okay, someone else has cottoned on to the fact that we can just pass this law, and that just deals with those difficult questions.
Yep, I think playbook is the right word there. And I think also the persecution, threat of litigation is another worrying trend of in Maria's case, she could spend the rest of her life in prison potentially, based on these charges. And I think also, in some instances you have journalists being tried, facing hearing after hearing after hearing for the work that they actually do. In other cases, it's trumped up charges. It has nothing to do with the nature of their work, the legitimacy of their work, and that is a really terrifying prospect. I don't know if it's the right word to use or not, but I think there really is kind of no nobler profession than bringing stories to light. And as I said earlier, uncomfortable truths. That it takes a level of courage, especially in this day and age, and that it's in these places where a lot happens in dark corners, and where you really need a light to shine. Increasingly, that's going dim, and that is, we have to fight for independent journalism, for plurality of journalism, and and the facts.
Facts matter. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why it was so troubling. You mentioned, Anna, earlier, the unprecedented numbers and scope of kind of incursion on press freedom in the United States, with the number of arrests, assaults by law enforcement on journalists. Obviously, we're talking about litigation, the court battle that a Des Moines Register reporter had to go through was, not up to Maria Reza's level, but it was a discomforting, invasive kind of attack on journalism, was what it really was. I'm being told that we're at an hour's time, so let me go ahead and ask what is our traditional final question for these international community talks, and I'm curious to hear what your answer is. Usually isn't so on the nose, but the question for both of you, I'll go to you first, Anna, is what does press freedom mean to you? We ask this of every guest at international community talks. Obviously, we've been talking about press freedom. You literally, your day jobs depend on press freedom and involve press freedom. So I'm curious to see what your answer will be. How do you, what does press freedom mean to you? And Anna, why don't you go first?
Well, yeah, thank you. And again, thank you for this conversation. These are important conversations to be had. And it is, I have to say, just anecdotally, when I got this job at RSF, for me, it was the perfect marriage of my experience as a journalist and kind of my first love of what is so near and dear to my heart, and being able to stand up and defend that, and then kind of pairing that with NGO approach, or it was really great. So it is there are a fair number of organizations in this space. But in particular, for me, having an international background, I really love that we focus on the world. And so thank you in particular for inviting me to speak about the index. For me, press freedom, I think it starts with an informed electorate. I think you cannot have a healthy democracy if you don't have an informed electorate. And so, and that begins with facts, but it's not, facts in an abstract form don't necessarily mean much. I think it's about context, and the journalist's role is to be looking at the past, at the present, where we're going, and to parse that, to make sense of it, to analyze it, and to be able to question that past and the present. But I think also there's an element of, at least I really hope that there's an element to providing a sense of possibility. I think that, especially coming off of the year that we've just had with COVID, and I mean, it has felt very grim, especially after 4 years of the Trump administration, when journalists were vilified for doing their work and called the enemy of the people from the highest office in the land. We have seen change. I'm not suggesting that, that there are a lot of underlying issues that need to be addressed. But I think something that journalists can do right now is provide that sense of possibility. And also, I mean, of course, it is basic things like, a safe environment to do work. But it's also an environment where human stories can shine through. That which gives us hope and a sense of possibility is, I think, an important part of what journalists do as the eyes and ears of society, and an important part of that prerequisite of an informed electorate that makes our democracies function.
Beautifully said. Jessica, what does press freedom mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to follow up on like what you said about like the idea of possibility, and I do think that like I completely share that view. I think that's just such an important part of what journalism can do. I mean, for me, like I see no difference between press freedom and just like good independent journalism. I think that press freedom is like the right to tell those stories, the right to ask those questions, and the right to play that role of helping people understand what's happening around them and why it's happening and what it means for them. And and for me as well, press freedom is like, it's essential and it's powerful, but it's also fragile, and we just have to really protect it, and we need to celebrate it. Like when Anna said about like this sort of shining the light on it, when you look at those like dark, really like tough countries to report on, and you see the reporting that comes out of it, I think that that's something that we should all be looking at and replicating, because if they can get out and do that story at huge personal cost sometimes, I think that really just shows that when you've got your back up against the wall, that journalism still has the power to make change even when everything else just seems hopeless. And I think that we just need to protect it. We need to just keep pushing forward and really just making the case for good independent journalism in all countries, especially the ones that are facing a sort of lack of any kind of media and diversity.
Yeah, diversity is as good a word to end on as any. Huge thank you to Anna and Jessica for taking the time today on this important subject to explain so eloquently and profoundly why we should all care about these issues. I think you guys packed 2 hours of insights into the last hour, which I appreciate. The international community has more of these sessions coming up with great speakers in the next month or two. So Dan's going to drop the website into the chat. Bookmark it, check it, and come back when we have more of these groups. There's also a really robust Facebook page and discussions daily on international journalism issues. So if you don't belong to that, please join. And thank you again, Anna, Jessica, and all of the guests. Keep doing good work, get vaccinated, and maybe next time we can do this in person. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Yay.